I will start with Andreas Novy. Andreas Novy is Associate Professor and Head of the Institute for Multi-Level Governance and Department at the Department of Socio-Economics at the University of Economics in Vienna. He is president of the International Karl Polanyi Society, and in 2019 he received the Kurt Rothschild Award, which is actually an award for economic journalism, together with Brigitte Aulenbacher, Richard Berntaler, and Veronika Heimal. Now he will introduce us to his newest article on the political trilemma of social-ecological transformation that just came out or was published, I guess, last week or 2 weeks ago.
Thank you, Melissa, for this introduction. Thank you very much to all of you, and we are really impressed with the huge amount of participants and the huge interest in this topic. Indeed, I've been working for some time on this article. A pre-version has been published a few years ago in a Brazilian journal, but uneven development also reflects itself in scientific hierarchies, and articles published in Brazilian journals are not read in the global north, or to a much more restricted way. But anyhow, that was really the starting point, and over the last years, the topic of social-ecological transformation on the one hand, the topic of social ecological transformation, but also the spatial issues related to this have become of key concern in policy debates, but also in scientific debates, and Karl Polanyi plays a key role in this. So what I will do in this presentation is try to give a focused summary of the article, focusing on aspects which I consider important for also understanding the current situation, but also for political interventions. And I will start with one slide that contextualizes the article before entering into three aspects that those of you who have read the article already know, a reflection on the two concepts of transformation by Karl Polanyi and on Daniel Roderick's globalization trilemma, and then how I advance it to this political trilemma of social-ecological transformation. To start with the contextualization, first, greetings from Kari Polanyi-Levitt. I talked to her 2 days ago. Unfortunately, she's not able to participate, but she is also co-responsible, let's say, for this article because her interests and her approach have influenced me. And that's not that explicit in the article. That's why I want to mention it, because Kari Polanyi-Levitt, in her last book, which has been recently translated to German, From the Great Transformation to the Great Financialization, she exposes a criticism of globalization. Already before the term has become so popular in the 1990s. And that has a lot to do with her development economics research and her strong involvement in the Caribbean countries and her interest in dependency theory. And those of you who are not familiar with dependency theory, the interesting aspect of dependency theory is that it was critical of integrating the periphery of the world economy into this capitalist world economy, and selective closure strategies of self-reliance have been seen as the most effective strategy for social development. There has been a lot of criticism, and not everything is unproblematic about dependency theory, but it's in huge kind of opposition to what over the last years has become a widespread positive attitude towards globalization. Yeah, what has been criticized is a specific form of globalization, but in itself it has been embraced, as you can read on the last 2 lines of this slide as well, by Polanyi scholars as well. Yeah? And that's interesting because Karl Polanyi also definitively a cosmopolite, a citizen of the world. He had an ambivalent relationship to liberalism in the West, while acknowledging the positive aspects of individual freedom and what he called the right to non-conformity. He was very critical of economic globalization, what he called universal capitalism, especially when dominated by one big market. So both father and daughter have this critical attitude towards globalization, which has been then taken up by Daniel Rodrik, and the article focuses strongly on him because he is probably the most well-known mainstream economist with a critical attitude already in the 1990s on economic globalization. And that's why I think for good reason he's at central stage in this article and in our reflections. Yeah, before coming to Daniel Rodrik, a few arguments are conceptual arguments on The Great Transformation, the main book by Karl Polanyi, and the way how he conceptualizes transformation in this book. And I mention this and elaborate this in the article because it's interestingly, the understanding of transformation in the common sense understanding of transformation is a little different from what I perceive as his understanding of transformation, because in my understanding, he distinguishes clearly between 2 forms of transformation. You know, on the one hand, and that has to do with his interest as an economic historian, and later on his interest in anthropology, in long-term development. And so he analyzes the Industrial Revolution and the implementation of market society in the 19th century. And he uses a very nice metaphor, the metaphor of the metamorphosis of a caterpillar. And I cite from page 44, the transformation of this system, the industrial society of the 19th century, from the earlier economy, the agrarian feudal economy, is so complete that it resembles more the metamorphosis of the caterpillar than an alteration that can be expressed in terms of continuous growth and development. So opposing this common understanding of liberal progress, he said that that's a profound change. And this idea of profound changes have led to many identifying this with the great transformation, and in this sense, because it is a great transformation indeed. And that's why it's so interesting in the 21st century with the ongoing profound changes to take up this long-term perspective. But, and that's his second understanding of transformation, and that's sometimes a little confused. Karl Polanyi, as an engaged citizen, was interested in understanding how the catastrophe of the 1990s, the revolutions happening as a response to this, to the disaster of liberal capitalism, the great world economic crisis that started after 29, fascism leading to the Great War, that was for him the event he wanted to understand while writing The Great Transformation. And what he did, and his key thesis, is linking the long-term and the short-term analysis in a key statement. And again, here I cite from page 32 of The Great Transformation. In order to understand German fascism, we must revert to Ricardian England. So translating this, in order to understand the tragedy of Central European turn to authoritarianism, racism, fascism, we must study British political economy, the idea of liberal market economy, classical economic thinking that developed 150 years ago, and that led to the specific form of the market economy implemented in the 19th century. And I think this linking of short-term and long-term dynamics makes a Polanyian analysis specific. Interestingly, that's not so often undertaken, but that's what I try with this article, and try to show what in a broad sense we can learn from Polanyi by applying this interpretation. So shifting now to Dani Roderick's globalization trilemma, which I will not present in detail because for lack of time and assuming that several of you already know it. And Dani Roderick presented it last year also in Vienna at his, when he opened the Viennese part of our joint conference with Budapest in May 2019. This globalization trilemma is the assumption that there are different policy targets that are in tension, and it's not possible to understand to achieve all three of them. It's a political trilemma that he describes. It's based on a monetary trilemma that's widely discussed in open macroeconomics on the policy space of monetary policy. And he kind of widens it to a political trilemma that you cannot have hyperglobalization, the nation state, and democracy at the same time. And he says the trilemma is pick two out of them. There are three options that you can choose, two of them going together. And in fact, this has happened historically in the 19th century. The gold standard linked hyperglobalization in the nation state. That was possible because democracy did not yet exist and mass politics. After the Second World War, the Bretton Woods arrangement that limited capital, that limited global financial markets via capital control, and thereby enabled policy space, led to linking the nation state to democracy in these decades after the Second World War. And with globalization, and that's the argument of Roderick, who developed this trilemma already in the 1990s, global governance could be the new kind of the model for the 21st century, linking democracy with hyperglobalization, as the nation state is an outdated institution from the 19th century that is not able to deal with the global problems we are facing in the 21st century, climate change, the proliferation of human rights, a peaceful world. And he criticized that this third, and that over the coming years, the criticism became harsher, that this is an ingenious and impossible alternative. Global governance in this understood in this sense of hollowing out the nation state and implementing a political order without territorial sovereignty. And I show in the article that Danny Roderick has developed this further, and I recommend you to look at his website where you can find more recent articles on these issues. He has tried to use this trilemma to understand right-wing populism. I think quite interesting analysis, and he has fine-tuned also his understanding of democracy, the nation state. But, and that's now the shift to the second part of the presentation, there are limitations. And the key limitation is that he assumes business as usual with respect to the socio-ecological basis of our political economy, he acknowledges the geopolitical changes, but I think he does not give due credit to the profound changes that this 21st century will face, and therefore to be more specific and draw different political conclusions. In the debate there is on transformation, there is this understanding that the transformation in the 21st century might again be such a profound metamorphosis as Polanyi analyzed for the 19th century, comparable only to two other profound changes, the Neolithic and Industrial Revolution. And that's important and relevant because both those revolutions were resulted in different modes of living, in different organizations of society, of our way of working, of the political organization. So it's not something that with e-mobility, with renewable energies can be solved, but it will affect the way we organize society and the economy. And that's, I think, has to do with and that's one of the reasons explaining why transformation is such a attractive concept. And I only use one slide, that's the next one, to show that this transformation will, these long-term changes will kind of undermine business as usual strategies. It's the so-called great acceleration. Many of you might know this, this dynamic of exponential growth inherent in our modern societies, and strongly driven by economic logics, by the growth imperative, the competition that forces innovation and growth, and that has implications for our resource use and exploitation, and exponential growth is unsustainable, and that's why we face the climate crisis, and that's why especially natural scientists increasingly urge for profound socio-economic, political, economic changes. And that's not acknowledged by Roderick, and that requires a fine-tuning of his concepts, what I propose in the political trilemma of contemporary social-ecological transformation. The one thing is, I've been teaching this for several years and increasingly became aware that it's not possible to to stick to this idea of pick 2 out of 3. If we look at contemporary problems and contemporary political events and political strategies, especially right-wing populism, be it Trump, be it Bolsonaro, be it Orban, is definitively difficult to understand how to frame this, because all of them do not criticize capitalism. All of them do not criticize participating in the world economy, but they have they don't acknowledge institutions, supranational institutions that define the rules of the game. They would like to be those who decide on these rules of the game, but they are not in this. The anti-globalism is selective. They have been elected in the case of these 3 politicians, and definitively there is democratic support, even if they lose the elections like recently Trump. So it's not in this simplistic sense of electoral democracy that they are non-democratic, and they have ambivalent relationship to the nation. Their nationalism is more or less hollow. It's very clearly nationalistic in Hungary. It's a selling out of national capital in Brazil, but that doesn't impede that the flag and patriotism is mobilized as a cultural identity. So all of these concepts, to understand a trilemma, one has to sharpen these concepts, and definitively, in my understanding, and that's my suggestion, it's more reasonable to say one of these 3 pillars and the policy objective is at center stage, and the other ones are secondary or not that relevant. And that's what I want to quickly show by in this remaining minutes. And I start with liberal globalism, summarizing what I've written. That has been the dominant approach over the last 20 years, and that has been threatened and frightened by right-wing populism and a little bit by left-wing populism. That's the policy approach from Clinton, Schröder, Blair in the 90s up to Obama and Merkel. The assumption to try to deny that the trilemma exists, or if it exists, those that has to lose in importance is national sovereignty. It's an interesting emphasis on negative freedom, which unites left defenders of human rights and individual freedoms against the state to those who defend property rights against the state. This idea of individual, of consumer sovereignty is a core concept in liberal globalism, why it's not simply a right-wing ideology. It has definitively support from the political left as well. It is cosmopolitan, and as I said, Karl Polanyi was cosmopolitan as well, but unfortunately cosmopolitanism he has always had a strong elitist and Western leaning, and more or less links to this understanding of Western superiority. And very often liberal globalism has then constructed this the key social conflict as a conflict, a cultural conflict between global openness and provincial backwardness. So the globalists and the nationalists, or however you call this, And they have gained this strategy with the election of Biden has kind of gained a new life, and that's why it's not over. Also, in agreement. I think in this respect, not that much agreement with Danny Roderick. See it as somehow outdated. That's the first one. I see that as outdated because increasingly a second version that was for long considered impossible, what I call nationalistic capitalism, has emerged. Because the self-marketing of neoliberals has always been the idea of being globalists and being in favor of overcoming borders, while if you look at neoliberal ideology, be it reading Slobodian or Mirovsky, as two theoreticians of neoliberalism, they stress this strong link of a strong state, an authoritarian state, and so-called free markets. And Pinochet, the Chilean dictator who came to power in '73, in this sense, is paradigmatic for neoliberalism. And if you have this understanding, the turn of many neoliberals to nationalistic capitalism is not such a great surprise. But for others, it has been a surprise. And I would say the core of what I call nationalistic capitalism is that I use the definition of Danny Roderick. You see it down on the slides. I'm interested in the state as a spatial. I cannot read this here. Whenever somebody wants to enter in the here, I get it pops up in the waiting room. I'm interested in the state as a spatially demarcated jurisdictional entity. And he argues this in favor of a positive role of positive policy space that territorial sovereignty offers. But it's in the case of Bolsonaro and Orban and Trump, it's this incredible appropriation of all state and public institutions, which in my understanding is at the core of what I call nationalistic capitalism. It's this appropriating of the judiciary, the police, the dismantling of civil society and countervailing powers, a very concentrating state power in the executive, which is at the core of this political project, which then, and very clearly in the case of Bolsonaro, can go hand in hand with economic neoliberalism. And unfortunately, even with the defeat of Trump, I consider this a very strong and powerful political project, and it has the huge advantage that it is effective. If you concentrate political power, at the short run you have policy space, and all these geopolitical confrontations, as well as the climate crisis, make authoritarianism an attractive option. And it is so attractive also because there is no convincing left alternative to this. And that's what I propose in the last two slides with the foundational economy. That's this pillar that Roderick called democracy and mass politics. And here the very limited understanding of democracy, liberal democracy, then he distinguishes this from electoral democracy, where civil society is weakened. But it is not aware that liberal democracy over the last 30 years has been hollowing hollowed out by neoliberalism. Think about the Troika in Europe, or the IMF programs in the global South. And it's not right-wing populism alone that had hollowed out liberal democracy. And what is needed is a broadened understanding of democracy, what I call socio-economic democratization. Democracy that's not only limited to managing the political domain, but being able to shape the social and the economic conditions of a society. And it is this, and here the key advantage of, in my understanding of what I propose as the third alternative, it's the only strategy that acknowledges the challenges of the social ecological transformation, the ruptures necessary in the basic economic institutions. So socioeconomic democratization is a strategy that would allow to focus, to put the economy in its place, like the International Karl Polanyi Society is arguing, in line with Karl Polanyi, kind of reducing the central role of the economy in our societal arrangements, focusing on the satisfaction of basic needs, and thereby reducing our negative impact on resource extraction and the climate crisis. And it is a strategy, and I cannot expose this without going too much beyond my time, that overcomes this, as I already said, shallow spatial confrontations between the urban nationalism and European cosmopolitism, or Trumpian anti-globalization, to acknowledge that the foundational economy satisfying basic needs is a multi-scalar strategy. It has a strong focus on local regional provisioning systems, but it clearly requires a global framework to deal with climate crisis and the global commons. So I termed this planetary coexistence as this form of planetary multi-scalar politics. And the last slide is a macroeconomic argument that I really found interesting and might stimulate our debate. I borrow this, or I take up a colleague from our university, Louison Caillin-Fourreau, who has written an article in 2020 on regulation theory, in which he came to very interesting results. Not so surprising is that the Scandinavian countries, including Germany and Austria, the more socially inclusive and coordinated forms of capitalism are more sensible to environmental concerns. And that's somehow good news, because the social and the ecological can be connected. Effective state agency can tackle the social and the ecological problems. But, and that's the huge but, but these economies tend to be more open economies. And while they are better environmentally in their internal policies, they are those who most strongly export their ecological footprint, being strongly export-oriented. They import resource-intensive products from the global south or emerging countries. So the export orientation is the Achilles heel of this apparently nice form of welfare capitalism, which then very clearly has, in my understanding, an implication that Louison does not take that explicitly, that it's this tradable sector dominated by private corporations transacting on the globalized markets, producing commodities, all types of products. They are the key actors in green growth strategies. And when we talk about making the economy greener and more efficient and producing greener products and all this, but that's at the core of unsustainability. And the foundational economy approach is an approach that aims at other ways of satisfying needs, that aims at sufficiency strategies, and that focus on the territorial organization of well-being and satisfying needs by focusing what the foundational economy calls the foundational goods and services: health, education, care, houses, food. And in this sense, and that's I end with this, arguing that sufficiency has to trump efficiency, and the collective provision has to trump individual consumption. And I leave it at that point, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We will go on with, wait a minute, I will close that. We will go on now with Franz Baumann. Franz Baumann Franz Baumann started his career at the European Parliament in Luxemburg before transferring to the European Commissions in Brussels, joining Siemens in Munich, and in 1980 he joined the United Nations, where he served in 4 cities on 3 continents in a variety of functions. His last assignment was Special Advisor on Environment and Peace Operations with the rank of Assistant Secretary General. He has been a visiting research professor at NYU, at the New York University, since 2017. Franz Baumann is a senior fellow and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Erhardt School in Berlin, a member of the Board of Directors of the Academic Council on the United Nations System, as well as a member of the Board of Advisors of the Center for United Nations Studies at the University of Buckingham. His PhD in political science was obtained from Carleton University in Canada. I will start his presentation, and we'll hand over the mic to Franz Baumann.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Andreas. Interesting tour de force. Let me start by saying hello to everybody from New York City, where in a few hours we expect the first snowstorm of the season. Thanks for pointing out Kari Polanyi's book. I happen to have it here. Andreas, you were too modest in not saying that you're one of the editors, and wrote a very beautiful introduction to a very important book. So I'm delighted to be here. I have a personal connection to Kari Polanyi. I've had it for over 30 years, and I'm sorry that she can't be with us today, but she will certainly hear the recording, and then she can tell us later how well we did. And so I very much look forward to that. In her 97th year, she is very sharp, and sometimes I speak with her at night and she exhausts me more than I do her, is my impression sometimes. Okay, but so I thank you also for the opportunity to reacquaint myself with the thinking of Karl Polanyi, surely the most famous, underappreciated social scientist of the 20th century. As panelists, we are invited to affirm and or criticize the arguments in the article and to introduce new perspectives. Let me begin with Karl Polanyi's striking metaphor, and Andreas, you have pointed it out, that the Industrial Revolution was a complete break with the earlier economy, like the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly. but it was not the great transformation, it was a transformation. And this is striking. He thought that in 20s, 30s, fascism was a greater transformation than the Industrial Revolution. And I do find that, I don't agree with it, because in my view, fascism had many more origins and causes, not least, for example, the catastrophe of World War II. I find it also striking that Polanyi only speaks about fascism. He doesn't speak about Nazism. And these are two different things. They have many commonalities, but they are two different things. So that leads me to my first observation coming from the outside. I find there is a lot of jargon. There are code words which are understood by members of the tribe, but not necessarily by others. Now, not being an economist, I also have to confess at the outset that some of the concepts, for example, progressive reglobalization or contested neoliberalism or entangled territorialized forms of self-determination, they strike me personally as exotic. I also have to confess that some of the contentions strike me as more declaratory than analytically helpful. For instance, the declaration that there are, quote, 3 options possible: globalization, nation state, democracy, unquote. Really? I see many more and would have liked the terms to be defined and historically and spatially situated than just used as mantras. Just because Russia holds elections, it is not a democracy in any meaningful way, as is suggested. Democracy, rule of law, transparent and accountable government, free and fair elections, independent civil society and media comes in many shades. Just look around. United States, look at Belarus, look at Hungary, look at Poland, look at China, Hong Kong, Russia, look at Thailand and many countries. There are huge variations and ongoing struggles. They must be recognized in their complexity and open-endedness, not just shut away in a drawer labeled democracy. Also, what is a nation state as opposed to a state tout court, where there is a very big difference in the literature? Okay, but globalization is more than just the borderless movement of goods, of capital. It also is the borderless movement of information and communication. That I'm sitting in New York and some of my students are invited and participating from China and India and Russia and Brazil. That is also globalization in the sense that we can cost-free communicate and exchange ideas, and they have material force. Also, let us not forget that globalization includes attempts at international solutions. Having worked at the United Nations for 30 years, I think that the conventions that civilized countries agree on, often they breach them, but laws on the books, speed limits do not prevent people from speeding, but when they're caught, there is a price, and even if it's only shaming. So the conventions on human rights, on children, on drugs, on chemical weapons, even agreements on climate change, on migration, are interesting, important elements of globalizations that should be somehow reflected in analyzing where we are and where we're going, particularly in the context of climate change. Now, there's one more point I would like to make, and that is that the analysis, like the 3 things, I find it rather Western-centric, namely fixated on the US and on Europe. That is important enough, granted, but it's not the whole story. China is mentioned precisely once. India, Africa, Japan, Saudi Arabia, very important. Saudi Arabia is the drug provider, fossil fuel oil of the world. It's hugely important in international transformation or preventing it. Latin America is not featured, and many other key countries are not mentioned. So, but they are relevant to the subject at hand. Let me go back to Polanyi and the transformations versus the great transformation. I fear that the end of the fossil fuel era will be marked by convulsions compared with which the two transformations, two prior transformations, namely from hunter-gatherer economy to the agrarian one and from agrarian to industrialized, were strolls in the park. We are moving into a horrendously dangerous situation where climate tipping points will be crossed and what will happen to humanity slips out of human control. So therefore, global heating, in my view, is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Put more technically, global heating is an unprecedented global public policy responsibility with emphasis firstly on unprecedented, secondly on global, thirdly on policy, and fourthly on responsibility. It is global because emissions in one part of the earth affect the climate everywhere. It is global also because individual behavioral changes or national or even continental policies will not suffice to avert catastrophe. That requires globally scaled policies, which obviously the market cannot provide, but also not just academic concepts. So what will drive social solutions, if anything? I am not sure there are, but so the origins of global heating are in our history, and Polanyi, industrial revolution or evolution as Andreas prefers, the consequences of global heating reach far into the future because what we do or not do in the next decade, if the curve on carbon dioxide emissions is not flattened, life on Earth for the next centuries, actually millennia, will be changed and it will be horrific. It is striking, I think, that neither Emperor Nero, nor Napoleon, or Hitler, or Mao, or Stalin could make the sea level rise. Today, we can and we do. Humanity is overwhelming nature, which is why our era is properly called the Anthropocene. Now, humanity's power is the result of the synergistic confluence of science and technology, of the massive use of fossil fuels, and of conducive social, economic, and political organization. Let me remind you that into the 19th century, human life was dominated by infectious diseases. Melissa, if we could have the first slide, please. Up to 50% of the children died before age of 5. Once infections were conquered, the world's population and production shot up. Look at this. It took several millennia to reach the first billion humans around the year 1800. It took another century for the second billion, then only 40 years for the third billion. It took 14 years for the fourth billion, 12 to the sixth, 8 to the seventh. And today we are 7.8 billion, and we will be 10 by 2050 and 11 billion by the end of the century. People with a legitimate right to a decent life. In parallel with population, and Melissa, next slide, please. Energy consumption drop, that is the cause of why we are where we are and why we have in the West, not elsewhere, the reasons for this massive explosion of production and productivity were scientific and technological progress combined with a colossal use of energy. First coal, as you can see, then oil, because you cannot fly airplanes with coal, and now gas. Now you can see up there a bit the renewables, wind, solar, but not compared with oil, coal, and gas. And that is the challenge, which if as humanity we are not fixing it.
Ich wollte ein Webinar
okay.
gucken und ich habe es vergessen.
All right. Okay. So, Melissa, if we can go please to the next slide. This is a slightly different presentation, Andreas, of what you showed, these Earth system, global systems, because it shows this relentless growth, particularly after World War II, where you see that world population increased from 3 billion to almost 8, but life expectancy, which is not there, from 52 years to 73 today, which is great. But also GDP, if your gross domestic product increased from 1.4 trillion, this is about $470 per capita, to 88 trillion today. I can't show 88 trillion. You would have to actually extend this column by a factor of 63. Amazing economic growth. The number of motor vehicles has quintupled from $250 million in 1970 to 1.4 billion, and it's expected to double again in the next 30 years. Airline passengers before the pandemic, of course, it was 300 million or so in 1970, over 4 billion last year. And it's expected, it was expected before COVID, to shoot up to double again by 2050. Global plastic production it's even more amazing than GDP because it was 1.5 million tons in 1950, and today it is 360, which means that this is about 50 times you have to extend this column. So what I'm trying to say, what drives this relentless growth? And why is it so difficult to change course? Well, I think producers, consumers, lifestyle preferences and lifestyle implications combine to a veritable spaghetti bowl of compounding dynamics, all of which drive endless economic growth, made more difficult by the fact that the consumption of goods and services are legal economic activities that underpin the vigor of the world economy. We see this now with COVID, where governments desperately try to keep Lufthansa, Austrian, Swiss, Air France flying. We know that is poisonous, but we, with public money, keep them flying. Or my provincial capital, Baden-Württemberg, is Stuttgart, where Mercedes is built, and Bosch and Porsche. A green minister president, premier, wants Mercedes to sell more cars and wants how do you call it, government subsidies to buy new cars. So to make this, or to this complexity, especially because it is a legal legal activity, and because this tremendous economic success and life expectancy is The flip side of this is the environmental catastrophe that we are experiencing every day more. Because mass production, mass consumption is such a triumph, changing it is so very difficult. Andreas rightly quotes in the article Ingolfur Blüdon on the implications of imperial lifestyle that is supported, he says, by a broad alliance to sustain the politics of unsustainability. Very powerful formulation. Sustain the politics of unsustainability. We are actually in a situation of, it's almost like drug addiction, where the drug dealers and the drug users have an interest to keep the racket going. The beneficiaries are happy to stay the course, no less those who aspire to join to be better off. And of course also politicians, because distributional conflicts are easier to manage in a growing economy than in a shrinking economy. Except that important constituents are not heard. Future generations, the people of the global south, and other species, they are the ones who pay the price for today's actions and inactions, even though none of them benefited from our choices. The beneficiaries of high consumption levels do not pay an adequate price for the imperial lifestyle, another interesting quote, but externalize it to the environment and to nature and to future generations and to poor people, especially in the global south. Melissa, the next slide, please. We're almost done. The great acceleration has a flip side, which is the great inequality. Just very briefly, on the very left, you see the world, and the gross domestic product in the world is about $11,000. In the US, it is over 60. In the EU, 35. In Japan, 38. So similar, Russia, 11. China, 9. Now, look at this. India, only 2. And in Ghana, 2. So what this means is that the GDP in the US is the equivalent of 30 times, 1 US, like 30 Ghanaians or 30 Indians. Emissions of carbon dioxide, the third column, in the world is about 5 tons per capita, but in the US it is 17, in Europe is 7, in Russia, terrible wastefulness, 11, China also 7, India 2, and Ghana 0.5. So what this means, 32 Ghanaians have the same emissions as 1 American. Or, if we, if you will, in Europe, it would about 15 Ghanaians have the same as 1 European. Our energy consumption, our emissions are slightly lower because of efficiency, but also more compact. We can go there. Now, this inequality, this is the challenge, and we, the the Western countries, the focus of Roderick and maybe also Polanyi, the US and EU, we have to shrink to allow India and Ghana and also China. Per capita, India has the largest CO2 emissions of the world, clearly because there are 1.3 billion people, but per capita, they are lower, and justice is not, you can't blame the Chinese for being 1.3 billion. It has to be done on a per capita basis. And so what is happening here is that in the West, we deal with the issue of acquired rights. We don't want to change because we have earned it. And in the global South, we are dealing with aspired rights. So In conclusion, I sympathize with the concept of foundational economy, and then a quote, that satisfies basic needs like physical health, autonomy, preconditions, and for effective participation in social life. But tell that to the people in Ghana or in Nigeria or in Chad. We as a global community have an obligation, if we want humanity to continue, to flatten the CO2 curve that needs massive, massive investments in transformational infrastructure, essentially electrification, doing away with all fossil fuels and moving to renewables. And given where we are, this is a massive undertaking that requires states, that requires private business, that also requires regulation, doing away with subsidies, having a heavy CO2 price. It is a political struggle that will determine the fate of the world. So this is the next great transformation that is hopefully coming and succeeding. If we're not succeeding, the transformation will be collapse of human society. So I hope that the great transformation that we will experience in the next couple of years is towards sustainability. Now, everybody says Paris Agreement, and that is fine, but the Paris Agreement is still a recipe for climate catastrophe. So Paris is as good as it goes, much better than nothing, but that is the beginning, and it has to be much, much more and faster and at a greater scale. So I thank you very much, and I didn't actually want to hold a presentation, but anyway, I found it very stimulating what was in the paper, and since I was invited to add a different perspective, I took the liberty of doing so. So thank you very much, Andreas, for stimulating paper, and thank you, Melissa, for organizing this event.
Thank you, Franz. I've seen that there are some, I've seen some hands, raised hands. Maybe you could put your questions into the chat and we will talk about them after our next speaker, which is going to be Judith Dellheim from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin. I will shortly just introduce her and then we will go on to not lose any time. Judith Dellheim is a senior research fellow at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin in Germany. She has worked on foreign trade of the German Democratic Republic. And since 1990, Judith has been working on solidarity economy, on political parties and movements, and on economic policies. She was a member of the Federal Board of the PDS in 1995 to 2003, a freelance scientific consultant from 2004 to 2010, and she has been a senior researcher at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation since 2011. Welcome, Judith.
Thank you for inviting me, for giving a 7 minutes comment to the sophisticated text and challenging presentation. I hope my comment will not frustrate Andreas or you in any way, particularly as I strongly support Andreas' main conclusion that we have to orient our efforts toward a sustainable foundational economy that offers, could you please, this sustainable foundational economy that offers access to essential goods and services for all residents, combined with planetary coexistence and international cooperation, what is the only strategy with the potential to concretize the Polanyian vision of equal freedom for all, place-based as well as embedded in a resilient planet. I very like this phrase. And accordingly, I especially like the 5th section in Andreas' text. On this basis, I should like to give 5 recommendations for our further work. First recommendation, to learn from Polanyi that we should maintain and develop our interest for details and therefore ask specifically who does, why, what, why, and with which individual, societal, and ecological consequences. This certainly includes the development of production and consumption patterns of actors and societal structures. What is related to what and how does this occur and what does it mean? So the analysis of actors in global and societal power relations and of their metabolism with nature needs more elaboration for making it really possible to work on strategies towards a sustainable refundation of the economy. The issue of biodiversity needs to be more elaborated and emphasized when speaking about living conditions of people. I shall come back to this. Second recommendation, to reread the Brundtland report in its original version, focusing on the interest of global poor, of the socially and globally weakest, and at the same time focusing on the issue of specific technologies for resolving or increasing problems. The Polanyian vision of equal freedom for all is difficult to criticize. But what does it mean for those people who today have to vegetate rather than exist? Who sincerely wants to help them to survive and to organize themselves in an emancipatory solidarity manner is the best partner for working on the sustainable reconstruction of our economy. But focusing on climate, while underestimating the issue of biodiversity, means to support those forces which are interested in large or huge technological projects for highly centralized production in TNC. In contrast, the local food producers mainly depend on biodiversity. Third recommendation. We also have to look again at history, especially from the perspective of the majority of the global population, the historically colonized. At page 10 of Andreas' text, we can read, the deglobalization of the 1930s and 1940s was violent, but brought an era of US hegemony as well as lasting social progress in the form of decolonialization and welfare states. People have fought for independence and lost their lives. The neoliberal globalization has been imposed by force, especially to change the form of needed transfers of resources from the former colonies to the economically ruling forces in the core capitalist countries. Fourth recommendation. We shall to rethink the terms of globalization and deglobalization. Finally, I fully share Andreas' observation of some ongoing processes of deglobalization, also and especially connected with international conflicts. However, the Hungarian ministers are very European when the speeches about Hungarian car industry suppliers. And finally, globalization means a global process of dissolution of the boundaries for primary and secondary exploitation. This is not above all a question about trade, of course also on trade, but about the appropriation of surplus value within and about TNC and of transfers of resources, not last of bioresources, labor force, brain drain, data, interest, and debt repayment. Under the Trump administration, deregulation has been given financial markets a new drive. So national capitalism can indeed reinforce globalization. But of course, a globalization process understood as an overcoming of such societal relations is urgently needed, and a completely different globalization of emancipation, solidarity, and respect for nature is also needed very urgently. Fifth recommendation. To look for actors and to consider more deeply who already aim at something compatible at the foundational economy based on planetary coexistence in the following directions. By working on conceptions like Buyen Vivir, Mother Earth, Commoning, Eco-Socialist Manifesting, for learning from other movements and joining forces for working on alternatives. By developing common action and campaigns, like for the UN Binding Treaty or for an international corona tax, to organize pressure on the transnationals and their governments and to help the globally weak. By working on strategies focusing on peace, health, climate, and biodiversity in order to develop interrelated and interactive sustainable political alliances on all levels, from the local to the global. Shortly said, the maybe biggest advantage of Polanyi's heritage is that it brings people together with very different backgrounds who would not gather on the basis of the Marxist tradition or Marxian writings, nor on that of a religious creed. This could make it also easier to effectively open a really global debate on needed transformations. And in the conclusion of my short comment, I should ask if the wish exists here to organize a discussion on the World Social Forum in the end of January. It means to invite scientists active within social movements and working on social-ecological transformation to participate in a critical reflection of Polanyi's ideas and arguments about the transformations we urgently need. Thank you for attention. I hope this was not longer than 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Judith. I don't think it was longer than 7 minutes. We have received a lot of questions already. Maybe we can start with a question from Artemisio. I hope I'm pronouncing that well, who says, I can clearly see where we can find real life models for the first 2 points of the triangle, so the nationalistic capitalism and the liberal globalism, but it's harder to identify the 3rd point as an existing frame. How to save it from remaining an utopia? What do you see the existing signs of its coming to be? Maybe Andreas, for you this question.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you also for the comments. And I've read some of the questions, but it's not difficult to work on several media channels. Let's start with this last question that you just asked. I think definitively this 3rd strategy is the weakest, but it is urgently needed. Yeah? And the 3rd strategy emerges out of this widespread polarization between whatever you call right-wing populists, climate change deniers, the bad guys, and then the good guys. Yeah? And the good guys in general embrace globalization in a very ingenious way. That was a starting point of this article. And I found and find support in Polanyi on being skeptical on this dichotomy. And the article is an attempt to overcome this. There was a version when deglobalization was in the title of this article, and I changed this, and I'm happy that I changed it, because I think the strategy is definitively in going beyond this simplistic for or against globalization. And that's also a little bit the question, the direction of Franz, because I don't have any problems with ambitious global climate policies. Simply, it was not this over the last now over 20 years. So where and how should this come from? Especially if you correctly argue that there are huge geopolitical rivalries. And if given these geopolitical rivalries, you aim at common agreements, it's difficult, and that's exactly why I argued or invented this term planetary coexistence, that say, fine, everything that Franz is calling for, very fine if it happens. I think there are good reasons why it is not happening, and what we urgently need, and that would be my question in direction of Franz, because he has not made a position on this. Do you agree that hyperglobalization, the way Danny Roderick defines it, or what we call neoliberal globalization, where you have supranational institutions that impose markets and property rights, that is a key hindrance to tackling the climate crisis? Because I think that would be a basis, and I consider this a key statement of the article. And then the point is, how can you overcome this hyperglobalization? You can overcome it with better global rules. And here I am on this side of Danny Roderick, that given the geopolitical rivalries, probably that these global rules should be few and the most effective possible. And then we need increased policy space at other levels. And that comes also to the question of Ana Fernandez and others about delinking and dependency school. I think that this idea of enlarging policy spaces, and that's the self-reliance argument, is valid for the global north and the global south, and it's valid in a different way, because if we take what Franz said on global inequality, and he said he used the word shrinking, and definitively that's necessary, but show me one important actor in Europe or North America who promotes a strategy of shrinking. And what I am promoting is indeed a differentiated strategy of clearly shrinking the global and tradable sector, while sustaining and transforming the foundational sector. I make a distinction between different economic sectors. That's at the core of this argument. And translating this to the global south, I think that's the policy space that should be widened exactly in the same sense, in satisfying the sustainable development goals or basic needs, or however you call it, and de-linking from this very negative ecological trade that kind of transfers resources to the global north, in one way or the other. Yeah, that's this, and then there is a lot of agreement with what Judith said, and I think her questions are very pertinent. And what I did, just for those who look at the this journal Globalizations, where I published the article, there is a new series on reglobalization, and indeed, I think what we need is getting a clearer understanding which type of globalization we want to shrink and expand, and which type of deglobalization is attractive and which has to be fighted against. That, yeah, and I will leave it at that point. Because the question was, and we have to elaborate what this third alternative could consist in, yeah? Because otherwise the reactionary version is getting stronger.
Mm-hmm. I think some questions of the questions asked are going into the direction of this balance, which Philippa also mentioned, between development and global warming. How can we balance this? She's asking because for her country, which is Jamaica, and also Anna Cristina, who asked how the dependency theory would fit in, and maybe Franz, maybe can you go a little bit deeper into these questions of how we can balance development with global warming?
Well, you know, this is an academic seminar, and I guess we are looking at theories, at ways to interpret reality. I don't think we are, at least, you know, I don't consider myself an activist. I'm supporting, of course, certain causes and so on, and in that sense, I'm an activist. But the world, look at it as if a Martian would come and land on planet Earth. What was going on? What is driving? What is preventing the survival of humanity and so on? That is, in a way, how I'm looking at it. We do not have a menu of options where we can choose what to do for development. What we have to see which forces are at play. And at the moment, indeed, I agree with Andreas that there is a certain deglobalization taking place. I also think that in the past 30 years or so, not because of neoliberalism ideology, I frankly think that there is an overestimation of what goes on in academia. Liberalism is driven by Wall Street. I also don't think, Andreas, that globalization is whatever neoliberals want, is strong global governance. Not at all. They are happy with weak states, and what has happened is that elections are run nationally, but economies run globally. And so therefore they can hardly be controlled. Now in the EU, we are probably better off than in most other places in the world, because you still have rule of law. You have the European Commission. You saw the news today about Facebook and about Amazon. Well, it's still very unequal weapons, because society is very diffuse, whereas Amazon and Facebook have the highest priced and paid lawyers. And so there is an asymmetry in, you know, states in America, but also in Europe, of course, are captured by powerful interests, whether it's the agrarian lobby, whether it's the fossil fuel lobby, whether it is, and they write trade contracts. This imbalance is clear. Has nothing to do with liberal ideology. It is power play in the marketplace. So how can anything be done about it? Well, civil society, activism, you know, 2 years ago, it was probably almost today, 2 years ago, that Greta Thunberg spoke in Katowice at the COP meeting was 24. This young woman has changed the world in 2 years, not the power relationship, but they have mobilized millions of people. The Green Deal in America, that Biden has to speak in favor of a Green Deal, that the European Union has a Green Deal, is due to what is now a 17-year-old woman. She was 15. Because she catalyzed what was there. And so civil action can make a, you see it in Minsk. They might not win, but they make a difference. Now, I think also that many enterprises, especially in Europe, not so much in America. In America, the discourse is still shareholder value is good, to hell, après moi le déluge, let us just Exxon, whatever. 4 weeks ago, Shell put out the most offensive ad on Twitter and elsewhere. Shell asking people, and what are you doing for the environment? As if, you know, recycling a bit more plastic is solving a global crisis, asked by the company that is at the core of it. So it is a political struggle globally. Frankly, I am not optimistic that it can be won in the 15 years that we have before the climate tips, because the political struggles everywhere, these discussions, the arguments that we are having, we are a small minority sect. For the Greens in Germany to get 25% to become part of a coalition with the Conservatives will be a miracle. If they would say what has to be said, you know, they said 8 years ago, whenever eat less meat, have a veggie day per week, that cost them the election. They said the right thing about that a liter of gasoline should cost €6, because that is the real cost. And now we are externally to the future, and that makes them unelectable. So this is not an easy answer. There are political struggles going on. I'm heartened when I see that now 100 odd people were participating in the seminar from around the world. That's for me a terrifically good sign. I'm not sure we can win it, but we can try it. Thank you.
All right. Maybe, I don't know if this really fits to this question, but Niels, you were asking a question about the lifestyle consumer choices, and that you think that the problem of the West seems systemic more than a result of choices. Maybe you can elaborate on that a bit, and ask the question to, I think you wanted to ask it to Franz Baumann, so that we know what you wanted to ask.
Well, I might have misunderstood you at a certain point in the presentation, but it was, and I think I got my answer just now in this answer that you just gave. But it was as if part of this problem with the increased emissions in the US and in Europe was due to consumer choices rather than, it was just mentioned in passing. And I just wanted to hear what your view was on that, if that was indeed, if I misheard you, or if that was what you meant.
I'm not sure I understand your question, the precise question. Can you please repeat it?
That it is about like having made bad choices as, you know, people who live in the West, say, that if only there were other choices being made or more actively being made. But I think what you just said about Shell asking people to recycle more probably is that same answer that I was looking for. And then I think I have your view on it.
Well, you know, I personally am not persuaded by moralizing arguments. Yet I would prefer people not to drive SUVs. I would prefer people not to whatever. But if you get into a moral argument, and of course I feel vulnerable, before COVID I would fly from America to Europe 4 times a year, terrible carbon footprint. But if then you have this moralizing argument, I'm not eating meat, therefore I can. No, I think capitalism has evolved and has grown. We live in a house here outside of New York City, 80 years old, built in 1931, which in the 50s, all internal doors were removed because energy was so cheap. you turned the heating on, the whole house was heated, or in the summer it's cold. So this is not because people were bad, because it was available. Think of these huge American cars in the 1960s. So that's why I'm saying it's all a political struggle. If the governments, the public sector has to provide the guardrails. If a carbon dioxide emission, if a ton costs 180 euro, $200, behaviors will change. And if it is $25, it will not change. I will challenge you, nobody in this group, over 100 people, knows how much you are paying for a kilowatt hour of electricity in your local markets. And you don't know it because it is so ridiculously cheap. It makes no difference. So why is that so? If electricity were really properly priced, people would know it and would save it and would run things at 3 o'clock in the morning rather than at 3. Look, we have a huge potential also of energy savings, but this is not coming on itself. It is a political struggle. One more point. 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, in America, the first Earth Day was held in 1970. And the Club of Rome, and ideas were that we are running out of raw materials. And the moral argument then was that we would eat the seed money for our next generations. We would eat it a lot, they would have nothing left. And of course now the understanding is not we're not running out of anything, but using it kills humanity. So the point is not to keep it for posterity, but to keep it forever. Fossil fuels have to remain in the ground. And just like with the abolition of slavery in America, where the southern states were told they have to let their most highly priced assets go for free. They were not compensated. You would have to tell Exxon, Shell, British Petroleum, Denmark, Norway, that their assets, Russia, talk to Putin, talk to Prince Bonesaw in Saudi Arabia, that his assets have to stay in the ground because they're killing the world. So what we have to do in Europe and America is to get out of the addiction. If we electrify and run our economies on renewables, you don't need platforms drilling, you don't need tankers, you don't need gas stations, you don't need that infrastructure. I'll assure you, within 5 years, only electric cars will be sold, not because somebody instructs it, but because they are much cheaper and they are much better. They weigh a third less. They don't have any crankshaft. So governments have to put incentives. And if they would use the market, namely a high carbon price, many things would fall into place. Bolsonaro would stop chopping down the Amazon because he would be paid for not releasing more carbon dioxide into the air. So there are lots of possibilities, and they're slowly emerging. They're slowly emerging, and the emergence started, I would say, in Katowice in 2018. Because remember, the first conference of the parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was held in 1995 in Berlin. The environment minister of the time, who was Secretary General of the COP1, was Angela Merkel, 25 years ago. The frame is there, but it is accelerating now, in my view, because of course the crisis is much more pronounced than it was 25 years ago, but also because of the civil society action of young people, Fridays for Future, lighting a fire under the bums of business, but also interesting businesses realizing that if they want to make a profit 25 years from now, they have to change. Insurance businesses, look, nuclear energy is dead, not because of me having a sticker on the car, Atomenergie, nein danke, no, because no insurance company is insuring a nuclear power plant. And so technological progress and political activism will make a difference. The question being whether it is fast enough. If we had 50 years, I would be very confident that that this battle is won. But we don't have 15 years, we have 15. And if we do it that quickly, that is my hesitation. But, you know, maybe other people are more optimistic and they will fight harder, and then we'll get it done. Thanks.
There were some questions also while you were talking about, for example, if raising energy prices would affect the poor the hardest, and if this is really a good green policy. Maybe somebody else, maybe also Judith, can you also talk about this? What would be your opinion on this? Or also there's a question for Judith. It was following on Professor Dellheim's 5th recommendation: who and which actors should take a leading role in a positive social ecological transformation? Maybe you can answer those questions.
Yes, I think we all agree that it is necessary to abolish the subsidies to the fossil energy. So this, of course, is needed, and this has consequences. So, and the question is about the power balance. Who should pay for this, for increasing the energy prices? And so, of course, it depends on the strength of the social and the left and the progressive forces to avoid that the poor or the population has to pay for abolishing subsidies and for changing the energy sources is urgently needed. So, and related to my 5th recommendation, I think that the problems which were described here show our weakness, because the ecological problems and of course social problems are reflections of the political power balance, and so of the weakness of the left. And so the left has also to ask themselves why they are so weak. And the other thing is, of course, what to do when we have to realize that we are the weak. So of course we have to look where are actors who do something what should be supported to change the power balance. This also means that a proposal made by a rich person or a politician we don't like has to be supported, then it gives a chance to increase the space for changes. But of course, and this is our challenge, it is necessary to look for the actors who do something reasonable. And so I think it is extremely necessary and useful to come together with the people who work on other conception, like Vienna, Mother Earth, commoning in the global south, in other countries, because they share that what Andreas described as a foundational economy. It is only another perspective, and that's why another approach, because they face different concrete problems and different concrete power balances on the national and regional level. So the question is how to bring these different actors to a common acting, so to change the power balance, to reconstruct the production pattern. So I think, of course, it is necessary to shrink certain concrete economic branches. It is necessary to shrink them. But on the other hand, and that's why I agree with Andreas, it is necessary to build up new necessary branches and also to reconstruct some. So it is necessary to reconstruct the production pattern, and that's why it is extremely interesting who is working on that. We have people on the local level who are active in doing this. I participate in the Berlin Energy Table. We do it in Berlin very concretely. So other actors do similar things. But the question is how to bring them together to support demands for big and really significant steps to change the, on the one hand, the power balance, on the other hand, the concrete economic pattern. So, and this, of course, is a challenge. What needs cooperation on very different levels, from the local to the European to the EU to the global, and to work on this big reconstruction process. And I think one question was extremely important, and we should try to give an answer. This was on the dependency theory. I think on the one hand, of course, it is so that we see that the people in the periphery and in economically weaker areas depend on that, what the ruling forces do in the core capitalist countries. But on the other hand, this doesn't mean that they have not spaces and possibilities to do something different, to do something alternative. And that's why I think that the dependency theory includes a danger to overlook that what is doing by people in the so-called periphery, in the depending countries. That's why it is so extremely important to look what the alternative forces do there.
Thank you very much, Judith. I think that also goes into the direction what Matthias London was asking. He said if not more radical measurements are necessary to break out of the various forms of oppression and unsustainability of the capitalist mode of production. Matthias, have we already kind of answered your question, or do you want to elaborate on it a bit more? I don't know.
Hi everyone, first of all, and thank you for the answers so far. Yeah, my question is, I'm just not sure. I'm a bit pessimistic about staying within the system and driving for like a change that stays within the global neoliberal system, because it is essentially based on distinction that perpetuates inequalities that not only involve like climate inequalities, but also social inequalities. And yeah, it is a question of like who can bring what to the table. And who will be responsible and what on a global scale. Because if everything is interlinked, then how can we make sure that everyone kind of brings to the table to this common project what they ought to do when they're still struggling to make up for the consequences of colonialism and developmentalism in their everyday life. I mean, when people are struggling to work and eat, like how can you expect that from them to think about climate justice? And these measurements seem to be okay political measurements, but political interventions only work within the welfare state, such as redistribution, taxes, whatsoever, but there's only a handful of welfare states around. So what do we do with the rest of the governments that can't really be held accountable for this? So yeah, I was just a bit pessimistic of whether this can be done from within rather than like completely breaking out of this, and if a transformation would actually entail changing the mode of life globally, which, I don't know, staying within the system, in my opinion, maybe wouldn't. Yeah.
May I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
When you recognize that the problems we face are a reflection of our weakness, how do you want to destroy the system? Of course, I agree with you. It is extremely difficult to do something within. And of course, we have to face all the problems which are connected with that. But we have to recognize that we are not so strong that we could from outside to do something reasonable. Another question is if it will be, or it would be possible, because we look at the necessity of transformation processes, not only on crashing and destroying and a revolution, what wouldn't realize the necessary reconstruction of production, consumption, and societal structures.
May I perhaps try and answer as well? And we are, as we are already also coming to the end of the webinar, what I tried in the article at the end, and that was a learning process, is exactly reflecting on strategies for changing the system. And I did not argue against trying to change the global rules of the game, that it's getting easier to move towards a transformation. I'm rather skeptical whether that's possible given the power constellations. And the charming element exactly of deglobalization or weakening the economic linkages, especially what Polanyi calls the one big market, this idea that you can put places into competition, that you put production factors into competition globally, that every private hospital in India is in a competitive competition to a renewable energy plant in Denmark. If you don't break this type of one big market, it is very difficult to imagine that diversity of alternatives becomes possible. That's why the point that hyperglobalization, or however you call it, is a key, breaking this is a key entry point to increase the possibilities for alternatives. The alternatives could be horrible, and that's the very vivid analogy to the 1930s, but it also opens the possibility for alternatives that are really systematic changes, and that was the idea of Latin American structuralism or dependency school. As I said, there are problems with this approach, but you see it with what is called new municipalism, when cities try to link ecological and social concerns, Barcelona and other cities, that these are steps towards a transformation, and all these steps are insufficient, but probably necessary and in itself useful. And the last point I want to say, because I think I have not mentioned this, but that's became very clear after the strong emphasis by Franz on the climate crisis. What the argument is that we have to link this climate crisis and ecological concerns, and Judith, for good reason, added the biodiversity as a perhaps as pressing issue from the ecological side, with social issues. Yeah? If we are not able to link these, and it's called sustainable development goals, is in all its insufficiency, but both that people can afford housing and energy, and it is sustainable and ecological. That should be the strategy. And in this sense, the pricing mechanism is not the best entry point. A much better entry point is the provisioning system, the infrastructure. You have access to free health, you have good public educational system, public transport system that makes it much easier, this transition. That has to be accompanied by redistribution, but that would be my proposed and preferred strategic entry point for social movement and public administration to work on this.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we have a few more minutes. Andreas, what should we do? Should we take another question, or should we come to an end?
I think it makes sense that Franz and Judith have a final word, and then we definitively are beyond 8 o'clock. And you have the final word afterwards.
Thank you. Now, very interesting discussion, and I think we should, this is almost material for a seminar, so we should continue and drill down on those various points to see where we are really misunderstanding, where we're just using different terminology, or where we are de facto agreeing but have different priorities and so on. So Judith, of course, pointed out very much that there is a crisis also of biodiversity, which is clear. And if you remember on my chart, it was there. I didn't speak about it because I was running out of time. It is very clear that in the last 50 years, the global population of vertebrate species has reduced by 58%. We are in a huge crisis. So global heating is one, plastic, biodiversity, and many others that will accelerate. I warn against saying this is better, we should do this rather than that. We have to do everything at the same time. Having a discussion that we should first do this and then later that is sidelining us. Secondly, we have to work with conservative people. We have to work with people in the business sector. The left in Europe is 15%, 18%. Let's be realistic what we can do. Also, if we make the climate subject a political one, so for flat shoe Birkenstock wearing vegans, that polarizes it. That's not helpful for winning and advancing. Look, I live in the United States. 74 million people have elected Trump. This is not just false consciousness. That's real. In 9 of the 10 states of the United States with the highest incidence of COVID-19, Trump won. That is the reality that we're facing. So, Andreas, fine, foundational economy infrastructure, no problem. But how will we get industry? If you have a high carbon price, internal combustion engine doesn't make sense. If you have a high carbon price, Putin and his thing will collapse. Why do we need gas? Because it's so cheap. If it is very expensive and we are self-reliant, we don't need fossil fuels, many of the crises also in the Middle East will solve themselves. So the market mechanism is a very powerful one, and I plead not to dismiss it for ideological reasons. The last point, Judith, about dependencia theory, I've studied that in great detail and lots of sympathy, so on and so forth. What I want to say though is the world has become very different. The elites in New Delhi or in Montevideo or in Sao Paulo or in Lagos or in Abuja or in Moscow or in Beijing have the same lifestyle, a Western lifestyle with 2 or 3 cars, and they are disconnected from their own societies. So it's no longer regional. You have a class system across the world. And again, there was the question about China. Yes, China is the workshop of the world, not because the Chinese live lavishly, but they produce the stuff and their statistics go up. Last week was a study from Oxfam, 1% of the population, the rich, which by the way includes all of us, I think, emit 50% of the carbon dioxide. That is the imbalance. It's no longer geographical by country, but it is within countries. And so how to change this? Only a price mechanism makes it uninteresting to spend a weekend in Lisbon. So why are we depriving ourselves of such a powerful tool? So anyway, so this is the outline for a seminar I hope the International Polanyi Society will organize. And then we can have these discussions in great detail and drill down and come up with powerful strategies that will solve the world's problem in the next 5 years. Thank you very much for having me, and I very much enjoyed being with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. Maybe Judith, do you want to say some words before we?
Yes, very briefly. I agree with Franz that it is necessary to use all possibilities to act and to support everybody and everything what could be help to change the things in the right directions. That's why I also think that it is necessary to look at the different alternatives on the local level, and also that what this young man, I forgot the name, said, that it is necessary to change the mode of living. But this, of course, starts with using the possibilities to change the own lifestyle. So this, of course, also is relating to an individual responsibility, what of course also belongs to a political activity. And of course, in the end, I also agree with the necessity to organize a series of discussions, and maybe this discussion could be a good starting point, maybe the best starting point. And thank you again to Andreas for the sophisticated text, and to Melissa for organizing this event. And yeah, let's hope for following good events.
Thank you very much, Judith. Yeah, we have already planned to continue this discussion. We have planned some webinars for January, and we are very much looking forward to the International Karl Polanyi Conference in April of next year, which is organized by our friends in Canada, in Montreal. Margie Mendel was here before, but she had to leave earlier because she needed to go to a meeting, but it will take place online as well, and we are organizing a debate on exactly this topic. So I can also send you the information if you want afterwards in a separate mail, so that you know what we are doing. And yes, that would be everything from my side. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and for also participating in this interesting discussion. And yeah.
Perhaps just this one sentence, because we have the newsletter that's sent out regularly, but we need you signing up we cannot do this for you. It's very easy to do going to the website. So if you enjoyed this discussion and want to get more information, just sign up and you will be regularly contacted by us.
Exactly. I will put our website into the chat, but I will also send out a mail at everybody who participated so that you will find it. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and yeah, have a good evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon from here.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Danke, Franz. Danke, Judith.
Okay.
Thanks to all.